Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments. Today we are going to discuss about the continuation part of social change in India. So in the earlier lecture we have discussed about the Sanskritization component, what Professor M.N. Srinivas have talked about, and especially with his observation from the Cooks community, and how it also talks about how the caste system has been derived and how it has evolved as a theoretical framework and as well as in the reality. So in fact today we will be talking about the Westernization aspect of it. So how the Western influences have brought cultural changes in Indian subcontinent. So in our last lecture we actually stopped about how, because starting from Indus Valley civilization, we were discussing about how the society is being framed and has been gradually getting a form, by its social institution, by its hierarchy of caste and how they were functioning. So from a Varna system to the Jati system, and then so how the institutions like marriage, all these things have come up, and which is actually framing a foundation for the society. And during the Gupta period, that is where, from the architectural perspective, that is where one can see a form of an idealization of the society. That is where the temple architecture starts. And in fact, which is also referred as a kind of golden age, because many inventions like some of the pi and the mathematical equations, and as well as you have some of the inventions, and also it talks about the barter systems, and it also talks about the revival of Sanskrit. How, because especially this is the phase where certain Sanskrit, the original, which was because most of the literature was being described in the Pali or Prakruti, and then how the originality of the Sanskrit, so that is where has been gradually, I would say, a kind of dilution which was happening. So that is where this was the time there was the emperors, they took back into the revival of how we can revive the Sanskrit and how we can protect our traditions. So that is why we have talked about the Sanskritization, because on one side, especially from the northern Indian perspective, we are talking about starting from Indus Valley and the Aryan civilization and how they were, but there is also a good amount of literature which has been produced in the south of India, and that is where we talk about the Sangam literature, which actually we call it about three periods, Sangam periods. So Chola and the Pandya and the Chera. So a lot of literature has been developed even in the south. And when we are talking about from an architectural perspective or from the planning perspective, that is where the rich scientific knowledge has laid down the ancient town planning principles, and especially we refer to the kind of Manasara. And similarly, in this other South Asian context like Sri Lanka, there are also like you have Maya Matha, and so what this Manasara talks about, it is a kind of ancient treatise on town planning and architecture, which has 75 chapters, and it talks about different stages of planning and construction, and it also reveals on 8 types of town plans according to their shapes. So obviously here there's a aspect of Vastu also comes into the picture, that is where the climatology also comes into the picture, and the way the social order is also being assembled in the whole, not only in the form of a dwelling but in the form of even this town layout. So I'll just briefly go through what kind of city plans and forms. So the very basic form, we call it as a Chaturmukha type. So what here it is, we have, so normally the temple, it's have a kind of center location, and that is how the whole divisions into 4 quadrants. And whereas the Padmaka, the lotus temple, where you have the temple on the here, and you have the shops and vegetables, and you have the palace here, and you have shops for other articles, and you have on the meat market, and the tank here. So in that way the whole, and you have the fortified wall in order to protect the territory, from the enemies. So this is another model of it. And whereas in the kind of Dandaka, where we have the Vaishnavites, the Shaivites, because even in the Hinduist philosophy, if you, especially in the south, it has been observed very much that there's been a very great contrast in to whom you worship. So there were castes who were Vaishnavites, who have a nama like this, and were the Shaivites, which have a, so their whole dress and whole the way they dedicate to the worship and their belief systems slightly differ, and that is how certain contradictions also evolved. So you can see Vishnu temple and the Shaiva temple, and this is a kind of Dandaka. And whereas the swastika, which is about the swastika model, again it have a temple here, and you have the Buddhist temple, you have the king's palace, so all these you have the king's palace, and you have, so in that way a kind of multi-religious model which is also coming. So this is how a kind of arrangement. And there's another option which we talk about, is again here the prastara, which is a conch type, which have a central temple, and it also talks about the Vaij, which is also the hospital. And then again, if you look at the size of for a very rich, and again this is again rich, and whereas you have the middle class, and you have about poor class. So even just by the size, they segregated with the economic status also have been a factor of this segregation, the spatial segregation. So again in the Nanjavarta, what you can see is again here the temple, which is the central part, and you have the tank, you have the palace, and you have the court. So this is more of a kind of administrative setup. But here if you look at it, very close to it is the Brahmin quarters, and then you have the school, the educational aspect of it, and you have the hospital, you have the theater, which is a social aspect of it, you have the residence of artists, which is almost on the periphery. So the priority was given even here, the Brahmins are close to the god, and you have the quarters for other caste, and the hunters and fishermen, which is more to do with the meat. So again this one is Karmuka, which is bow. So the similar models of it, you have the temple here, and you have the college, so education, and that is how the moat around the city which protects from the enemies. And this is again a Sarvotabhadra type, which is a quadrangular type. So one of the important reference which I would like to bring to you is especially if you are looking from a sociological or an anthropological perspective, it talks much more of these principles and the caste orders, the social orders, the historical aspects. But how we relate to the space, that is where one of the important contribution I would like to refer is the Bonnie G. McDougall's work. And it talks into how a text has been translated into form, and from a dwelling level to the cosmos and the design theory, and especially covers a wide range of South Asia. So it's not only in India, he talks about the Tamilian aspect of it, and he talks about the Sinhalese, the Sri Lankan aspect of it. So he's done a wonderful anthropological study of on, and much of the work has been translated in English. So in fact, the very typical forms of this concentric rectangles, how a royal palace scheme has been laid out. So even if you look in a forbidden city of China, what we discussed earlier in the power lectures, so that is where also you can see the whole hierarchy of from how the power transfers from dominant to the public, and at the same time from the public to the private as well. And the Bonnie also, he talks about the Sinhala Maya Matya, and Ullava, who he translated all these which were available in Sinhalese language, and he have actually articulated how, in comparison with, I mean, in fact, his discussion starts with even the Le Corbusier's and B.V. Doshi's work on their understandings of what Le Corbusier have understood about the Indian context, especially designing the Chandigarh, the Punjab city, and that is where how relevant is this Indian ancient philosophy. So that is where from there he takes into the whole discussion of these what different the Sinhalese traditions, the Tamilian, the Manasara and the Tamil traditions, how they actually correlate with each other, especially in the form of dwellings and as well as in the city forms. So in fact, the general town layout, which talks about the central part is a kind of Brahma, Daiva, Manusha, Paisacha. So it goes in an order of the godliness to the people. So that is how this is what the Maya Mata and the Manasara, which talks about the basic layout. And normally the town layout, which he refers with a kind of the sizes which has been referred, the town layout is 9.57 square and 10.8 square meters. So you have the small gate and you have the sewage outlet. So so basically they talk about the sanitary aspect of it, the hygiene aspect of it, how it can be controlled, right? So a good example of today's similar layouts, what you find is Srirangam. So you have the rectangular pattern and you have the central Sri Ranganatha Swami temple. In fact, we did a study with our students from School of Planning and Architecture Bhopal, the 2008 batch, and they documented the whole transforming temple streets, which has been published in IIST Berkeley as well. So the central, most of the Brahmin community live nearby temple, and then they have these fortifications from each segment, and there's a high walls, and each layer has predominantly occupied by different occupations. For instance, in the second layer, I have found mostly of this kind of goldsmiths and then if you go further down, that's where you see the potters. So basically the wealth, it also kind of symbolizing the wealth process. But in today's context, it is reversing, because much of these younger generations of potter's sons or any blacksmiths or the goldsmith's sons, how they have become educated and how they're qualified enough to do some other jobs rather than, and now whereas the people who completely resided in the spiritual occupations, obviously they are sustaining with a kind of meager income. So it's the whole process is reversing because of various educational institutions coming in and various alternative livelihoods people are choosing. So there's a whole set of transformation, and which is clearly seen in the impact on the built forms. The bigger houses have been breaking into the smaller partitions and smaller houses, and in some other cases the new modern materials and modern technologies coming and irrelevant of what is existing. So they're completely transforming this whole area. And the other thing you can see, what one could actually notice is the whole transformation. Earlier it was more of a religious based, but now it is now becoming a kind of tourism based. So transformation from a religion orientation to the tourism orientation. And when we talk about the medieval city of Jaipur, again it talks about the mandalas and how Ekapada, Dvipada, and how these mandalas have been incorporated in the planning of Jaipur. And so till now we have talked about various traditional knowledge behind planning the cities, towns, and as well as even the dwellings, how different it has portrayed, it has directed to define certain forms, and how the social orders also has been accommodated. But when we talk about the westernization, especially from the work of Professor M.N. Srinivas, and that is where he refers not only from the colonization aspect, but he also referred from the Islamic and even starting from Delhi Sultanates and to the recent Mughals. So from 11th, 12th century onwards, there has been invasions in Indian subcontinent, from the West. And in fact, if we talk about before Mughals, we talk about the Delhi Sultanate's work. So, for example, we are talking about 12th century to 15th century, and here about 300 years. There's 5 dynasties which have ruled Delhi. One is the Slave dynasty, and the Khilji dynasty, and the Tughlaq dynasty, and the Sayyid dynasty, and the Lodi dynasty. So, in fact, if you look at how the fusion of the existing cultures and the foreign cultures have been merged, this was this very transferring phase of Indian society. In fact, if you look at the very brief history of Qutub complex, what you can see is there's a whole Qutub complex which is built in time, which has evolved in time. For instance, in 736 AD, the Tomar king Anand Pal found the fort Lal Kot. It's called Lal is red, and later in 1180 the Chauhan Rajput kings conquered the Lal Kot and extended and renamed as Kila Rai Pitora. And then in 1192 later the Sultan of Afghanistan, and he attacked the Indian subcontinent twice and captured the Delhi in his second attempt, defeating Prithviraj Chauhan. And that is how, as he was not having any heirs, so he treated his Turkish slaves as his sons, and one of his favorite slaves, Qutubuddin Aibak, has been given an in charge of Indian land. So that is how the Aibak has declared himself as Sultan in 12th century, that is started the slave dynasty. So in Qutubuddin Aibak, where he talks about started the foundation of mosque, Quwwatul Islam, and planned the tower to celebrate the victory of Islam. So the whole process of Qutub Minar and the tower, it gone in stages, and it has been developed in stages, and this has been developed to celebrate the victory of Islam. So, and that is how then later on it has been followed by his followers, Shamsuddin, Iltutmish, and then he extended and doubled the size of mosque and embracing the Qutub Minar within it. So he added, later on he added 3 more stories to the Minar, and the arches of the screens have a proficient Islamic craftsmanship and inscriptions. So what you can see here is a combination of both the Hindu traditions and as well as the Islamic traditions. For instance, if you see the ancient iron pillar, it's referred to almost the 3rd century. This, they say it's referred to some king called Chandra. Probably it could be for Chandragupta. So time. So they still made it as an iron pillar of those days, and in the courtyard of Quwwatul Islam Mosque, so which you will find here. And again you have the Alai Darwaja as well here, and here which has the motifs of, you can see a blend of Hindu symbolic motifs, and as well as, because the inspirations from the local culture and as well as the nature, and how they blend it with the kind of their Islamic belonging. So this is very interesting, the Alai Darwaja, and then you have the mosque and how they extended it. So in this process, that is where the famous author who have written extensively on Indian architecture, and Percy Brown talks about the pillars of mosque as a whole, a confused and somewhat incongruous improvisation. So basically it is a very continuous improvisation, and you can see the styles of how gradually it has improved. And so the first story is comprised of semicircular and triangular ribs. So you have the semicircular and the kind of triangular ribs alternatively. The second story is comprised of semicircular ribs only, and you can see here. And the third story is only the triangular only. So the kind of blend, and again you can see the Brahmical motifs like the Khalsa and lotuses on the pillars, and you can see some of the intrinsic Hindu architectural motifs. So there's a blend of architectural styles. One is addressing the locale, and then it is what you know, what you have brought and what you know already. So this is an important aspect. So in this phase of it, there's been obviously the Mughals has followed upon it, and especially a lot of conversions have started taking place. And in that process of conversion, certain institutional setups were made in order to propagate their Islamic religious aspects. And then when we from here we are talking about the colonization, because you see, British was not the first one to come to India. Before that, you see, it starts from Portuguese from the 14th century and you have the Dutch and then the French, the British colonial, which is much more recent. So I'll just show you a few maps of, in fact, from the end of 14th century. So that is where the Casada India, and because there was no direct link in the sea routes, so they used to handle the trade only to Africa by the Muslim merchants. But after the discovery of direct sea route, the spice trade, because of the spice trade, so they tried to stop over, and then they finally used to reach. And this has become a very new and important activity of the Royal Trading House. And again, the Portuguese East India Company, it was a very short-lived and ill-fated attempt by Philip III of Portugal to create a national chartered company to look after interest of Portuguese India. That is where we see, even today we have the Goa, and there's various small colonies, even and whatever the built forms they have constructed, even they do exist even today. And the Dutch, which followed upon the Portuguese, though they don't have a complete authoritative rule in the Indian subcontinent, but still they have a kind of, they used to use a kind of geographical definitions. So for instance, they talk about the Dutch India was divided into small governments, Dutch Ceylon, Dutch Coromandel, and Commandment Dutch Malabar when you talk about the Kerala side of it, and where you have the Coromandel side of it, the Coromandel coast, that is where, and we have the Malabar, and you have the Dutch Bengal, and you have the Dutch Surat, and you have Dutch Myanmar, so there's various small governorates which they have established. And the Danish India, and see, by that time in about 16th, 17th century, you see a lot of colonial influences have started emerging in India. And especially in the Danish influence, you can see from even in the southern coast, Tamil Nadu, the Nagapattinam, Karikal, especially the place called Tarangambadi, where I lived and worked for 6-7 months for my study. And you can see that how these Danish influences also, and at the same time, if you look at the whole coast, especially in the southern coast, the French as in do exist in Pondicherry, and then if you go just 3 hours down, you'll see the Tranquebar, which is a Danish colony, and like that you see the Karaikal. Again, there's a blend of different colonial influences. And what they did was they also, apart from the trade, they also started certain administrative setups, and they also started some kind of, they established their forts and their governor bungalows, and as well as they established some schools as well. And again, the French establishments, what you see in today, Annan and the Pondicherry and Karaikal, so which are still existing in the colonial part of Pondicherry. So that is where the British have entered little late, about 16th, as a East India. They entered as a East India Company, and especially for for the trade of basic commodities like cotton, silk, and indigo dye, salt, tea, and opium. This is the kind of India in 1700s. If you see English, or especially in Kolkata and in the Bombay, very small parts of it. And whereas from the company rule in India, so because East India Company was a private owned by stockholders and reporting to the board of directors in London. So this formed as a monopoly on trade, and it gradually took on governmental powers with its own army and judiciary. So gradually they started interacting with the local kings, and they started selling the ammunitions and the gunpowder, and that is how gradually they had got a control of various parts of kingdoms, and the company rule have lasted till 1858, especially with the revolt of 1857, which is one of the important landmark. And this was abolished, and with the Government of India Act 1858, so the British government assumed the task of directly administering India in the new British Raj. So the British Raj starts from 1858 to 1947 until the independence. So this is how you can see the maps of how various places has been under the control of British Raj. So you have the British territory, and you have the Hindu territory, and you have the Mohammedan territory, and how gradually it has taken over. And at that point of time, before the partition, of course, Pakistan as a part of Indian continent, and what they did was they did establish in order to develop the trade, and in order to develop, because they understood the underlying realities of the Indian communities and the caste systems, and also the vulnerabilities, like for example the sati system and some of some of the inhumane systems which we were following, and that is how they tried to bring the universal understanding of humanity, and through the education, and especially with the connecting the infrastructure and network. So education is one of the important resource they have invested in the country, and which has tremendous changes in the whole society. For one of the instance, if you look at it, you see the whole range of railway networks in by 1909, how they planned even in the place where I am living in the Roorkee. I mean, in fact, we had a small they started about the canal projects for irrigation purposes, and that is how, in order to do the canal projects, obviously instead of bringing manpower somewhere else, they thought of deciding why not we can train the locals here, why not we set up an education institutions. So that is how today our institution of today's Indian Institute of Technology, once it was a James Thomson's College of Technology, where they started educating the local people, and that is how the human resource has been educated and again deployed in the projects. So this whole process took some time, and education has gradually taken, and at the same time the press was invented, and whatever happens in England, it obviously used to reach here, and the sea trades, and obviously many inventions have happened, industrialization process has started. So if you look at around 1909, how the majority of the Hindus population, and over 80%, you can see that the Hindu population are there, and here you can see a little less, and whereas if you see the majority of Muslim population is more, and again part of other religions like Buddhist, Sikhs and Jains. So this is a kind of religious mapping. And then after the partitions, what you see here is during the British Raj, there are also an unexpected famines, and the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878. So about a decade famine, in which 6.1 million to 10.3 million people died, and Indian famine of 1899 to 1900, in which 1.25 to 10 million people died. So basically, there was a need and the death of some irrigation projects. So how they can channelize and how they can bring the connectivity between. So it's all been thought at that stage, and that is where, due to various freedom struggles, and India got independence, and the Pakistan got divided from the India, and gradually the East Pakistan, referred today as Bangladesh, has been. And then what they did was because in the British time, The new rule and the new institutional setups have been set up, and many colonial buildings have, especially in Calcutta, if you see the whole Victoria Memorial and the Madras Government Town Hall and the Bombay Town Hall, the local transport systems, the whole infrastructure is a new setup, and which has congested cities, which has brought many people from the villages migrating to there, and especially during the partitions, people started migrating, and they have established various railway stations, courts for a civilized world, hospitals, the medical science, quality of life, and post offices, urban town halls and clock towers for civic setups, and have the hill stations, the cantonments, and also they have started the ASI, Archaeological Survey of India. And so with all these setups, there's a huge change in the Indian society. One is, earlier the Brahmins were considered as one of the top class, but you see when the education have come into the practice, and various Western influences have started emerging for a decade of 4 to 5 centuries, and for a time of 4 to 5 centuries with all the colonial influences. So the change of dress, the earlier dhoti have come into a trouser and pant, trouser and shirt, and the style of eating, we were eating with hand and now with forks, and the manners, and the change in the medium of instruction. English has become a universal medium, and so this is where this Westernization process has an impact on the elite, because they have studied the secular subjects with English as a medium of instruction, and the Brahmins and other castes who have stuck up with this tradition of learning and tradition of science in the course readily took to secular education with English. So basically there was a huge transformation, because whatever the meager incomes they were having, so they understood that we need to educate. So that is where many of the Brahmins also have taking this leaving the traditional education and going for secular education. And earlier Brahmin used to be a valued person because of his knowledge and because of the way his rituals are conducted. But now there's a big change in the Indian society because by the new system of education, because all the schools were thrown up, all types, in contrast to the traditional schools. Earlier only Brahmins were allowed to educate, but now everyone is able to educate. So that is where it actually led to the kind of modernization. So modernization in India has come about due to Westernization. Therefore, the above mentioned changes of modernization can be taken as a result of Westernization. So gradually, when these cities are congested and things like that, if you look at, there's also the control measures, Bombay Improvement Trust Act, Bombay Town Planning Act, and then the Bombay Town Planning Act in 1950, which is talking about the reconstitution of plots, which talks about the size, shape of ownership of any original plots can be changed. And so it also talks about the purposes of public amenities. So basically gradually when the cities are growing, these control measures development control measures have started emerging. And till now we have discussed about the colonial aspects, especially the Westernization, which has led to the kind of modernization. And in the next class we will be talking about the modernization, and especially after the post-independent time and till today's globalization. Thank you.